Hi, I'm Lindsay Demetris. I'm a volunteer for the PHRA Social Media Committee. I'm here with Joe Bongiovi, who just did a fabulous keynote presentation for our second day at the annual conference of 2016. Really what I want to understand from you, Joe, now
Sure.
is for the folks that weren't able to join us, what was it all about? It was great, but what was it all about?
Yeah. So what I did in this presentation is I talked, the presentation is really about the key attributes for organizational effectiveness. And I grounded it a little bit. I won't go back through the whole detail, but I grounded it a little bit in the history of the work on organizational theory and the work on organizational effectiveness. And I talked about the compelling reasons today in this highly dynamic, very, very competitive world we live in, why organizational effectiveness is even more important than it ever has been before. Of course, people have cared about this for a long time, but it's never been more timely than now. In fact, one of the things I didn't bring up in the presentation this morning was just some research being done right now about fewer new organizations are actually being founded now than ever before, and organizational mortality is higher than it's ever been before. And this is being driven by how competitive and challenging and dynamic the landscape is. So we got to get our act together, and so this presentation is about how we do that. I grounded this in the history of organizational theory and organizational effectiveness, but I really zeroed in on kind of three what I call ideal models of organizational effectiveness in the modern world. One of them is a process-driven model, which Toyota Production Systems, GE with Six Sigma, Danaher with Danaher Business Systems are very good examples of how organizations take process, hone it to a fine level, and use it to make their organizations very, very effective. I then talked about a metrics-driven approach, and organizations not just using metrics, which of course we all do, but using metrics to drive their overall organizational effectiveness. And Amazon's an incredible example of that. I just saw them down the hall, and Google is very famous for this work as well. In my previous employer, Michael Baker, we worked hard at trying to use metrics to help drive the business outcomes as well. And the point there is that a metrics-based way of running your business can be very empowering for people, but it can also be very challenging. And some of the organizational scholars that have looked at this approach say it's just as easy to really screw things up with an algorithm and metrics-based way of running an organization as to get it right. But it can have handsome rewards if you do get it right. The third approach I talk about is people-centric. And I made the point in the presentation, when I say people-centric, I'm not talking about people are our most important assets, or we care about people, or people are vital. I'm talking about companies that actually put people at the center of running their organization. And sometimes that means without a safety net. That means without a parachute. That means, we're going to test people out. We're going to do the best job we can picking them, but they're going to have to prove themselves. When they don't prove themselves, we'll change and we'll go get somebody else. So it's not always touchy-feely, but it's really about people centricity. And the organizations that do that do it specifically because they don't believe that for them or their industry or their time or whatever, that a process approach or a metrics approach is going to work. They think that, and I use the example of Cree, where I had the opportunity to spend some time with Chuck Swoboda, who's their CEO, and he told me, if we were process-centric in such a dynamic industry, they do LED lighting, they're cutting-edge producer of LED lighting, we'd be dead in the water because we wouldn't be able to move fast enough for this market. We've had ideas, he told me, that come up. We put a person in charge, they're able to bring that to fruition in a matter of weeks, whereas a process-driven focus would be months, and we'd miss the market. It doesn't work. And Netflix, Zappos, these are other examples of people-driven businesses. Netflix famously threw away their policy manual. They threw away their HR policies. They threw away their vacation policy, and they said, we're hiring adults here, and if they can't figure it out, we hired the wrong person. They don't have any variable compensation. They want people who are intrinsically motivated in their organization. So I looked at these three models, and then basically I concluded that for all of their strengths, each one has limitations. And so the key to success is balancing those three out. And then I asked the question, okay, are we done? Have we now solved for all organization problems? And the answer is no, because this has to be grounded in strategy, effective strategy that's well communicated and implemented. HR I argued in the presentation, plays absolutely the key role in linking strategy development to strategy implementation through its organization process, through its talent processes, through its rewards processes, so on and so forth. That's good news for HR practitioners, I think. And then the other piece of it is culture, because that forms the base of organizations. And if your culture doesn't reflect what you're trying to do, then you're going to have a hard time really being effective. And the point I made there is that we don't really have the ability on our own to dictate what the culture is going to be. We don't just pronounce it and it becomes so, because there's many different actors that are involved. But as leaders and as HR practitioners, we can play a role by articulating it, by living it out in practice, walking the talk, if you will, and then by rewarding and reinforcing people who live the culture that we want, in telling stories about them. Storytelling is an important part of cultural development and culture implementation. And so just in closing, I brought together those 5 things, and I said it's kind of like pistons on an engine. If you're not hitting on all cylinders, you may have a fine engine, but you're not really going to be very effective. And so in a nutshell, to boil it down, that's what I talked about
It
today.
was terrific, very well-rounded. And what I personally enjoyed about it is that you really took the time to understand different organizations, what they were doing, and were very clear about it, that you also backed it up with some of your personal reading.
Yep.
Right? So that being said, do you have any books out there that you highly recommend, or one book for an aspiring or maybe established leader, HR professional, that you highly recommend, that must go to, must read immediately?
Yeah, it's hard to boil it down to one, but I'll mention a couple, because I went through this presentation and talked about quite a few of them. I'll just try to go more or less in order of, how I see importance. There's one that I recommend. It's called The Good Job Strategy. It's by a MIT professor named Zeynep Ton. I mentioned in the presentation that she's from Turkey. She came to the U.S. on a volleyball scholarship for women's volleyball program at Penn State, which, in addition to being near and dear to our hearts here in Pennsylvania, is the winningest NCAA Division I sports program ever. And so she had an opportunity to be part of that. She got her PhD at Harvard, and she now teaches operations supply chain management at MIT. But her book, The Good Job Strategy, came about as a result of her research, which demonstrated that organizations that focus heavily on good process and good technology, but don't complement it with a strong HR practice, strong people practices, tend to fail. And conversely, organizations, and then she got interested, even though she's not an HR researcher, she got interested in this. She said, well, what about the other way? What about organizations that focus on people first? And she found that without the right process behind them, they fail as well. And her conclusion was the two have to come together. Great book, highly recommend it for any business leader, HR people in particular. I also talked about in the presentation a slightly older book by Larry Bossidy and Ram Charan. Larry Bossidy was the CEO. He was the deputy chairman at GE when Jack Welch was getting started. And I personally, and a lot of other people, think that he was really the genesis behind GE's success in the 80s and 90s, but regardless, he left when Jack Welch, kind of fully stepped up after mentoring Jack, and then he went to Allied Signal, turned that organization around, and when they merged with Honeywell, he took over as chairman and CEO of Honeywell. I think Larry Boss is probably, if not the best, certainly one of the best business leaders of his generation. And Ram Charan, I would argue, is the best business consultant. And they wrote a book in 2000. They've written many good books since then, but some of them together, some of them separately. But they wrote a book in 2002 called Execution, and it's about strategy development and strategy implementation. And they're the ones who basically came up with this point that HR is the key link between strategy development and strategy implementation. And so I think that's good, and that points really HR practitioners in the direction of how important their role can be and should be driving organizational success. So there's many other really good books, many of which I highlighted in the presentation, but those two in particular I would just run out and go by right now.
Really great suggestions. I appreciate that. Do you have any advice for HR professionals, maybe that you've received or that you like to give to HR professionals out there, maybe just getting started or somewhere along their career?
Yeah, the biggest advice, and I mentor a lot of HR folks. I mentioned in the presentation, I'm the faculty advisor for the UNC SHRM chapter, so I'm working with young students who want to go into HR. Maybe they've had some internship opportunities, but they're very early in their career. I mentor quite a few mid-career HR professionals and some executives, quite frankly, right now. And the thing that I try to emphasize with all of them all the time is you are or should be a technical expert in HR, but that's only the ticket into the venue. And what really is going to drive your success is your ability to understand business broadly, understand the business that your organization is in, and then understand the impact that you can have from an HR perspective in driving that business outcome. The more business-centric you are, or the more organization-centric, I sat with a woman today who's at a nonprofit organization, so these are not always for-profit businesses. It could be universities, it could be the military, that could be PHRA, but wherever you sit in this organizational continuum, your ability to understand the mission of the organization and what the people part of it does to drive the outcomes is absolutely successful. That is, I would argue, far more important than understanding every nuance of the HR technical part of your job, which is important as well. But again, it's your business centricity, whatever business you're in, is the biggest advice that I always give to HR people I'm working with.
Fabulous advice, fabulous. So, question for you.
Okay.
Not as serious.
Okay.
What is your favorite John Bongiovi song?
I'm
just kidding. I'm just kidding. But seriously, I'm very curious. When I had the opportunity to interview you and I saw your name, I want to know how many times a day, a week, people say, your name sounds a lot like John Bongiovi.
Almost always when somebody says, I have a question for you, I almost always know that what comes next is, are you related to John
So I did that.
Yes,
to you.
exactly. Yeah, always happens.
Well, thank you. It was a lot of fun and really great information. We appreciate it.
Great.
Thanks.
Good. All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.